Today is November 28th, which is the 200th birth anniversary of a great figure in history, that is of Friedrich Engels. I think we all know that Friedrich Engels was a co-founder of scientific socialism along with Karl Marx. But unlike Karl Marx, who is, in academia especially and in the West, in Europe, appreciated nearly universally, Friedrich Engels is considered to not have the same reputation intellectually or politically even. And in fact, there is a substantial body of work and of people who consider that Engels in one way or another distorted Marxism. In fact, I'd say that Engels has become the whipping boy of what is referred to as the New Left. What makes Engels controversial is his very famous work called Anti-Düring. Düring was a professor who wrote on socialism and took a reformist view of socialism. And Engels criticized him and felt that he had distorted the doctrines of socialism and it confused people. Anti-Düring was the work from where then later dialectics of nature, as well as Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy and socialism, utopian and scientific were extracted. And Anti-Düring also is one of those works that made Engels very, very popular and famous and won over an enormous number of intellectuals within Germany. So while Anti-Düring had its opponents even in the 19th century, it isn't till the mid-20th century that really the anti-Engels movement takes off, at least in academia. And of course, it's centered in the New Left and it's centered in what we consider to be Western Marxism as opposed to Soviet Marxism, which owns the entire writings of Engels and considers Engels to be an equal founder of scientific socialism along with Karl Marx. So how did the New Left take off and begin? In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev made a speech known famously as the secret speech, since it was not made in front of the entire Congress of the party but was made in a secret session, in which he condemned Stalin and alleged that Stalin had killed millions of people and so on and so forth. Now this led to hundreds of thousands of people leaving communist parties in Europe and forming new organizations that are referred to as the New Left. They thought that Soviet socialism had gone horribly wrong and that they were still wedded to the idea of socialism, but they wanted a more democratic kind of socialism, or that's at least how they put it to themselves. And one of the key theoretical works in the emergence of the New Left is an earlier work which is published in 1923 by Georgy Lukács called History and Class Consciousness, in which Lukács suggested that Engels made the error in examining dialectics and in examining materialism and so on, and that the most vital interaction, Lukács argued, namely the dialectical relation between subject and object in the historical process, was an interaction that Engels ignored or misinterpreted. This became really the touchstone, the keystone argument of the entire New Left. Whether we talk about Western Marxism is really the foundation of the New Left. So whether we talk about Adorno or Habermas, or we talk about Marcuse, or we talk about any of the great New Left intellectuals, really one of the key arguments they make is that what Soviet Marxism got wrong is owing to Engels, and what Soviet Marxism got wrong is the relationship between the subject and object. For them, they alleged that Marx had resolved the subject-object conundrum or question in the theory of praxis. And this they hold to very strongly. I will speak about this in just a little bit, but I just want to put this in front of you. This argument saw its full development in 1961 with George Lichtem's book, in which he alleged that Engels had distorted Marxism and he'd reduced Marx's theory of praxis to a positivist science, much like Auguste Comte, etc. And that in fact this was a mechanistic kind of materialism, a kind of materialism that was vulgar. He had vulgarized Marxism. In fact, Marx, according to Lichtem, had achieved a sort of synthesis between idealism and materialism in the theory of praxis, and that Engels ignored that, or rather sidestepped it, and created his own positivistic form of materialism. The same argument was taken forward by Donald Clark Hodges, who alleged that the young Marx had become the hero of Marx scholarship and the late Engels its villain. So the New Left generally considered Engels to be the villain in this entire story and considered that Engels did not philosophically agree with Marx. Similarly, in 1968, Alasdair MacIntyre wrote, quote, "We must await the coming of the revolution as we await the coming of an eclipse." This, he alleged, were the views of Engels, that Engels considered history to be an unfolding similar to the unfolding of natural history, and therefore that the revolution was inevitable and that the revolution was coming. These were sort of mythologies that Engels had placed into Marxism rather than things that Marx himself had elaborated. Norman Levine went a step further and alleged that Stalinism really is Engelism. He writes, and I quote, "There was a clear and steady evolution from Engels to Lenin to Stalin, and Stalin carried this tradition of Engels and the Engelsian side of Lenin to its extreme." In other words, the New Left now came to believe that the positivist, scientistic or ideas of Engels led to a mechanical kind of Marxism, which in turn led to mass murder in the Soviet Union. John Holloway similarly writes that science in the Engelsian tradition, which became known as Marxism, is understood as the exclusion of subjectivity. So what that means, of course, is that Engels, while being right about examining objective phenomena, was unable to convincingly demonstrate what the role of subjectivity was, or whether it even had a role. So for him, human beings were like physical objects, or just as physical objects would have their laws, in much the same way human beings, or human history rather, would have its laws. And this, the New Left thought, was absolutely untenable and was a distortion of the works of Karl Marx. Paul Thomas similarly writes, Engels' post-Marxian doctrines owe little or nothing to the man he called his mentor. That's a pretty strong statement, because we all know that Marx and Engels had a very, very close relationship. He writes that a conceptual chasm separating Marx's writings from the arguments set forth is such that even if Marx was familiar with these arguments, he disagreed with Engels' view that human beings are in the last analysis physical objects whose motion is governed by the same general laws that regulate the motion of all matter. In other words, what is being contended here is that it is Engels that introduces the idea that history obeys certain laws, and that Marx was not sort of open to this idea, but rather was more open to the idea that history was open-ended and did not have certain laws that could be discovered and understood. Terrell Carver writes arguably the most comprehensive work on this particular idea that Engels distorted Marx, and he says that whereas Marx saw science as an activity important in technology and industry, Engels viewed its importance for socialists in terms of a system of knowledge, incorporating the causal laws of physical science and taking them as a model for a covertly academic study of history, thought, and somewhat implausibly current politics. In other words, it's really the fault of Engels that the laws of natural science are being applied, or we think that the laws of natural science can be applied to the study of history. This really is the fault of Engels. Marx didn't think so, because, well, there is some weight to this argument only in the sense that what differentiates natural science from social science is that the things that we are studying in natural science do not have any self-consciousness, and the entities that we are studying in social sciences, in history and in politics, have a self-consciousness, have an idea about themselves. They're self-conscious being. A rock is not self-conscious, a projectile is not self-conscious, a rocket is not self-conscious, water is not self-conscious, but political leaders, political parties, political movements are self-conscious, and individuals are self-conscious. So in that sense, the idea is present in much of Western academia that the study of humanity and human history cannot proceed along the same lines as the study of science, cannot even be perhaps a social science. To try and make it into a social science is a grave error in judgment. Similarly, Tom Rockmore writes, Marx and Engels agreed politically but disagreed philosophically. So there you see the crux of the matter, that although they both wanted a revolution and socialism and so on and so forth, but their epistemology is quite different. So alleges the New Left. I actually completely disagree with this, and there are lots of intellectuals and Marxist intellectuals who also disagree with it. For example, Sebastiano Tempanaro says everyone who begins by representing Engels in the role of a banalizer and distorter of Marxist thought inevitably ends by finding many of Marx's own statements too Engelsian. And that's true. I mean, you can look at the works of that Marx wrote individually, and you will find that Marx is talking about the laws of history. He is talking about the relationship between productive forces and the relations of production in a very determinist way rather than in an indeterminate and very open-ended way. Similarly, Stephen Rigby, who wrote a very important biography of Engels titled Engels and the Formation of Marxism, published in 1992, and Dill Hundley, who also wrote a very important biography, The Life and Thought of Frederick Engels, also published in the early 90s, 91, both contribute to the idea that there is no divergence between the writings of or the thoughts or the philosophical premises of Marx and Engels. Rigby insists that, quote, attempts to counterpose the views of Marx and Engels are essentially a strategy to forestall a confrontation with the problems which lie within Marx's work themselves. Similarly, Hundley writes, in most respects, the two men fundamentally agreed with each other. Perry Anderson, in fact, even goes to the extent of saying that Engels' historical judgments are nearly always superior to those of Marx, and Perry Anderson himself is encyclopedia of an intellectual. Alvin Goldner writes, Engels has been made the whipping boy of Marxism, Leninism by the New Left. And I think this is a wonderful phrase and quite accurately describes what's going on. So everything that the New Left and Western Marxism found problematic with Marxism, Leninism, which was not just restricted to the criticism of the regime of the Soviet Union, but even Soviet Marxism itself, its philosophical premises, the way it approached various questions, was ascribed to Engels rather than to Marx. In this particular way, they wanted to, take Marx away from Marx, the legacy of Marxism, Leninism, and re-understand Marx in a new light. But I think my personal opinion is that this is not possible, really, because many of the ideas that Marx writes about, he develops with Engels, and many of the ideas that Engels is writing about, he develops with Marx, including, for instance, the Communist Manifesto. The draft of the Communist Manifesto is written by Engels. It's called Principles of Communism. If you read that and then you read the Communist Manifesto, you see that in terms of content, they are actually very, very similar. And one can say the same thing about the German ideology and many other things. Now, speaking of the German ideology, I want to talk next about the thesis on Feuerbach. The reason I want to talk about these particular theses is that they were penned by Karl Marx, although the book itself, that is the German ideology, was co-authored by Marx as well as by Engels. But if you look around the internet, there are very few very good lectures on the thesis on Feuerbach, what it really means. And I think the reason is that, well, the theses themselves are quite obscure, difficult to understand. But perhaps the deeper reason is that I don't think there's been a lot of very good scholarship on the thesis on Feuerbach. There's been a lot of scholarship on it, but not very good scholarship on it. And a lot of people who think about the thesis and write about them do so without really referencing or looking at what those theses are in fact talking about. In other words, the work of Feuerbach and Hegel, which Marx is criticizing. So so what I'd like to do on this 200th anniversary of Frederick Engels is to read with you the thesis on Feuerbach by Karl Marx, and to show you that in fact it is Marx himself who developed the epistemology that we think was developed by Engels, but in fact what he is really suggesting over here is something quite different. So the theses on Feuerbach have been used by members of the New Left and Western Marxists to argue the case that Marx thought in a different way to Engels, and particularly the first thesis is used in this regard. So let's read through the thesis. The thesis states, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively. Hence, in contradistinction to materialism, the active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which of course does not know real sensuous human activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects really distinct from the thought objects, but he does not conceive human activity itself as objective activity. Hence, in the essence of Christianity, he regards the theoretical attitude as the only genuinely human attitude, while practice is conceived and fixed only in its dirty Judaical manifestation. Hence, he does not grasp the significance of revolutionary, of practical, critical activity. Now, that's what the New Left means by praxis. Now, the first major problem that we encounter in understanding this thesis, aside from the fact that the language is quite obscure, is how we understand the word sensuousness. How do we interpret the thesis, and how do we understand what the thesis means by the word sensuousness? Now, Sidney Hook translated this particular, he translated the theses, and he wrote that the passage raises the question to what extent man is active in knowing. Please pay attention to that, because that's very, very important. What extent is man active in knowing? In other words, is the brain merely passively receiving information, stimulation, signals, etc., sensory perception, and merely just passively receiving it? Or is the brain actively organizing that information in some way or the other? Now, generally, the idea of the active and passive brain was given by Aristotle about 2,500 years ago. And Aristotle had already discovered that the brain not only passively receives information, but actively orders the information that it receives. And that's quite self-evident today for anybody who studies psychology. If I look outside and I look at the clouds, you'll see faces in the clouds. Why do you see faces? The faces don't actually exist. But we project the faces because we order the clouds in such a way in our mind that we think that we're viewing faces. So do we order the information we get? Of course we order the information we get. The retina, on the back of the retina is created only a two-dimensional and inverted image of everything we see. So the brain reorganizes the information that we receive through our eyes and creates in our own mind a three-dimensional picture, which is not really what is at the back of the eye. So does the brain actively reorganize the information we get? Absolutely. Did Marx not know that? Of course he knew that. Is this a new discovery? Absolutely not. This is a discovery that's 2,500 years old, as I told you, because Aristotle has already spoken about, passive versus active learning, and the passive brain versus the active brain. Moreover, you see that in German philosophy, Kant, of course, considers that the brain has certain innate ideas or a certain innate framework, and that we tend to look at the thing in itself, that is everything that exists outside of ourselves, in such a way that is altered by or is informed by certain innate ideas. In other words, we are bringing order into the world where order may or may not exist. We cannot really know, because we cannot really know the thing in itself. But our brain is used to thinking in terms of time and in terms of space and in terms of causality, and so we ascribe to things time, space and causality even when they may or may not actually exist. Now, Kant doesn't say that they don't exist, he just says that we can't know whether they exist or whether they exist or not. So you see here that what Sidney Hook is doing is going back into that Kantian framework, into that Aristotelian framework of thinking whether we are actively ordering the information we're getting, or whether we're just passively receiving the information we are getting. Now, this is a question of cognition. This is a psychological question. This is about how the brain orders the information or reorders the information we get. This is not a philosophical or epistemological question. This does not regard the theory of knowledge. It only is about how the brain processes information, which is a cognitive question, not an epistemological one. Regardless of how the brain processes information, we have to understand the relationship between ideas and the material world. That, of course, is an epistemological question. That's a philosophical question, not a question of cognitive psychology. So how do we answer that question? Well, the matter is simplified by the fact that Marx himself explains his first thesis on Feuerbach in the German ideology. He himself elaborates on it when he writes, Feuerbach's understanding of the sensuous world is limited on the one hand to mere contemplation of it, and on the other hand to mere sensation. He says man instead of real historical men. Now, to give you some context, what did Feuerbach say? What was Feuerbach's great thesis? His book, of course, is The Essence of Christianity, and that's the book that Marx read, and that's the book that Marx is referring, because that book had a huge influence on Marx, and that is the book that Marx is criticizing in his book, The German Ideology. Now, in the essence of Christianity, Feuerbach makes the argument that God is nothing other than the alienated expression of the highest aspirations of man. So mankind has aspirations that we will know more, we will be more powerful, we will be able to do the things that we want to do, we'll be more truthful, we'll be more courageous, all of these things. What we tend to do is we are none of those things, but we want to be those things. So what mankind does, Feuerbach argues, is that these species essences of man are externalized and then worshipped by man in the form of God. In other words, God is nothing but the ideal expression of man. God is what man aspires to become. So in this way, Feuerbach thinks that the essence of Christianity is love, and the essence of Christianity is really the essence of man. This is also referred by Feuerbach himself as the anthropological conception of God, or the anthropological interpretation of Christianity. But Marx thinks that this is the wrong way to approach Christianity and the wrong way to approach history. Marx thinks that what Feuerbach has done is that he's spoken about man as an abstraction rather than actual existing men in the circumstances in which they lived, in the time period in which they lived, in the economy in which they lived, in the kind of society in which they lived. So for instance, a Marxist would typically approach Christianity by examining what were the circumstances in which Christianity was born. What was the Roman Empire doing? What was the Jewish enslavement about? What was the revolt against the Roman Empire? What were the different classes of society at that time in what is today Israel? What were the different classes? What did they want? What were their ideologies? How did these ideologies contradict each other? What were the material interests? What were the ideological interests? All of those things. But a Marxist analysis would situate the rise of Christianity in the material and subjective and objective conditions of that particular time. And of course, Christianity then evolves and changes as well, and its evolution and change is also impacted by the material conditions, that is the subjective and objective conditions of those particular time periods. So Marx would want us to examine any idea or in its full historical context. And what he feels Feuerbach has done is that he has removed that idea from its historical context, made it ahistorical. He has not examined the rise of Christianity in relation to the people who thought of, developed Christianity, but he's thought of the rise of Christianity as being the essence of man. This man is an abstraction, doesn't really actually exist in history. It's just a concoction that Feuerbach has come up with. So Marx says, in fact, human sensuous activity becomes a part of the external world. Again, this is something that Feuerbach refuses to understand, and Marx emphasizes. Marx says that for Feuerbach, the objective world exists just sort of naturally or in some way like that. What Feuerbach has failed to recognize is that the objective world, the world that exists outside of ourselves, is a world that man has created. By man, I mean humanity has created. I don't mean it in the gendered sense. So humanity has created the world that we are calling the objective world. Take for me, for example, I'm sitting here in my room. Everything around me, this is my room. I mean, it's made of bricks and mortar and so on and so forth. There's a desk, there's a sofa, I'm sitting on a chair, there's a camera in front of me. All of these things are things that we ourselves have made. But we've not only made things that are, separate from nature in the sense that they are not natural things, but we've remade nature itself with the agricultural revolution. We've shaped, we've carved, we've planted, we've sown, we've reaped, we've harvested. So what we are considering to be the sensuous world, the world outside of ourselves, is a world that is created by ourselves. It's not a world initially, obviously, we inherited that world from nature, but we have shaped that world. And in shaping that world, we have shaped ourselves, because through the activity of labor, by shaping that world, by working in that world, by plowing and putting seeds in and building things and writing music or composing music and painting and writing literature and so on, whatever activity we have done, whatever things we have created through that activity have in turn created us. We are what we have created. We are what we have worked on. We are nothing other than our own activity. So on the one hand, we are creating things through our labor, through being productive. But on the other hand, the things that we are creating are processes that are creating us in turn. Engels wrote about this also in his essay on the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man, where he says that it's really labor that transforms the ape into what we today consider to be a human being. What we are today is a transformed ape, transformed because of our activity, transformed because of our labor, transformed as a result of the intellectual stimulation that our mind has received and through our bodies and with our bodies and so on. So mind and body, we have been participants in activity, and that activity has changed us. This is something that Feuerbach cannot recognize, does not understand, that the subject in fact is part of the objective world, not only just that it's part of the objective world, something that's emphasized again and again by the New Left, but that the objective world itself is also created by the subject. So while the subject is part of the objective world as a being made up of matter, of bones and blood and muscle and tissue, the objective world which exists outside of ourselves is similarly made up of something that we have altered by our own activity. Hence, Marx says that our labor confronts us as the sensuous world. We created the sensuous world. The sensuous world is, in a certain sense, the alienated expression of our inner selves. This is something that, of course, Marx takes from Hegel. Marx continues, he says, the active side in the Thesis and Feuerbach, he says, the active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which of course does not know real sensuous activity as such. So what he's saying here is that Hegel did recognize, unlike Feuerbach, Hegel did recognize that through the activity of labor, we are creating not only the world outside of us, not only that which we consider to be sensuous material things outside of ourselves. We created those things. But at the same time, in the process of creating the sensuous world, we created ourselves. We learned, we evolved, we developed, we intellectually evolved. So we created ourselves. So Hegel, of course, writes that through the master-slave dialectic, the externalization of our Geist creates a civilization, and then we are able to recognize ourselves by the things that we create. We go through a process of self-recognition in this. But Marx continues, and he says, which of course does not know real sensuous activity as such. What does Marx mean that Hegel does not know real sensuous activity as such? He means, of course, that Hegel does not recognize that this is, on the one hand, Hegel does recognize that this is the activity of men as such, but Hegel thinks that there is a great collective unconsciousness, a great world spirit, a great Geist, which is getting to know itself through humanity and through the externalization of itself in the form of civilization. So in fact, it's not really even human beings that are doing the things that they're doing for Hegel. It's something beyond them. And that thing beyond them is this Geist, this great unconscious, this great world spirit which is becoming conscious of itself. Now, Marx thought this is idealist nonsense. There's no such thing as a great world spirit getting to know itself or through the activities of history and mankind, etc. No, what is getting to know itself, and the people who are getting to know themselves are human beings. That's it. There is no great collective unconscious or conscious. It's individual people in different circumstances thinking, acting on their circumstances and making history. History, in other words, for Marx is nothing other than the activity of human beings. There is no force above human beings which is the cause of history. But Marx did recognize that human beings are unable to control their history. In other words, whatever it is that they desire ought to happen in history does not really work out that way. So they desire that they desire to create a society which is just and equitable with liberty, equality, fraternity. But the kind of society they create ends up having greater poverty, despite the fact that the intentions of all the people who got together to create that society were not to create poverty, but to create equality, and yet poverty is created. So in that sense, Marx is suggesting that humanity is not in complete conscious control of its own history. And because humanity is not in complete conscious control of its history, humanity thinks something is guiding history. There is a pattern, there is, history is moving forward, or maybe moving in a circle, or whatever is happening is being guided by some force, and that force is what humanity has referred to as God. So God is the alienated expression for Marx of that comes into being as a result of the fact that humanity cannot and has not been able to take conscious control of its own destiny. So in that sense, then, Marx, while he feels that there is a material foundation for why religion exists and why we continue to think that human affairs are ordered by things outside of humanity, will have none of it. He considers that human affairs are only ordered by humanity and nothing which is metaphysical, nothing which is transcendental from the material world. Marx explains, Hegel understood that work in abstraction is the self-reproduction of man, his behavior towards himself as to an alien being. In Hegel, however, let me just pause here for a second. So you see here that Marx is saying that Hegel understood this. In fact, Marx took it from Hegel, frankly, that in creating the world, man creates himself, humanity creates itself. But Marx now criticizes Hegel, says, in Hegel, however, the act is only formal. By formally means exists only in form. Content is missing, because the human being is appreciated only as an abstractly thinking being, as self-consciousness. In other words, it's not the human being which is thinking, it's a great self-consciousness which is the Geist, the spirit which is coming to know itself. It's a great collective mind. And here is where Hegel has gone wrong, because here is where Hegel, again, also, much like Feuerbach, has refused to recognize men as being, or humanity, sorry, as being the creators of their own history. Hegel understood that production produces both the sensuous world and develops the consciousness of man, but he imagines that this is really the result of the world spirit rather than the action of man itself. To put it very briefly, Hegel makes the mistake of thinking that this is all the result of a great unconscious. And that's why Marx says that Hegel is unable to understand real activity. By real here, of course, he means the fact that these are real people who are undertaking their activity and creating history. Now, before I end, I have to say that, talk about his comments on the dirty Judaical, that expression that he used in his dirty Judaical form. Is Marx being anti-Semitic with this particular comment? Not at all. In fact, he doesn't put it in quotation marks, but he's directly quoting Feuerbach. Feuerbach says, utility, profit, is the supreme principle of Judaism. The Jews have maintained their peculiar character until the present day. Their principle, their God, is the practical principle of the world, egoism, and egoism precisely in the form of religion. The practical viewpoint is a dirty viewpoint, stained by egoism, because in it my attitude towards a thing is only for my own sake. So you see here that Feuerbach's criticism of Judaism is that Judaism is too concerned, it's a stereotype, I admit, but his criticism is that Judaism is too concerned with practical stuff, making money, the economy, etc. And this is egotistical in the sense that we make stuff because we want stuff for ourselves. We want to have a better life. And so Feuerbach dismisses this and says he wants to look at a higher principles of love, which is for all of humanity, rather than things that are for the ego, for the self. Now, Marx will have none of it. In fact, in the German ideology, he says that he writes that those communists who think that communism is all about destroying the ego are absolutely off their rocker. They're talking nonsense. That cannot happen. In fact, the expression of selfishness and egoism is sometimes necessary as self-assertion. On the opposite side of that spectrum, of course, is Stirner, who thinks that egoism alone will lead us into communism or into a more ethical society, whom Marx also criticizes. So on the one hand, he's criticizing those who think that communism is all about altruism. On the other hand, he's criticizing those who think that communism is all about selfishness. Both sides, he says, are talking nonsense. So in other words, Feuerbach is regarding practice, that is labor, production, economic activity, as something dirty because it is for the sake of the self, rather than for a higher, noble, ahistorical principle, which for Feuerbach, if you've read him, is love of all of humanity. So for Feuerbach then, the expression here, that it's dirty, it's Judaical, etc. The expression that Marx is referring to is not referring to the Jewish community, but to Feuerbach's expression. And what he is criticizing is not that stereotype, but criticizing Feuerbach for ignoring production, for ignoring man's activity in the process of labor, which of course we can recognize it takes up most of our time, and would definitely take up most of our time in a time period where man's productivity was very, 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 very undeveloped. Most of the day we spend working, unless you're a student and just sit around listening to YouTube. I'm joking. But you get the picture that labor is a very important part of the activity of humanity. And by labor here is not just meant your job. By labor is meant all your creative activity. Whether you do it, whether you sit in your room and you're painting or playing music, that is also activity, productive activity. Activity in which you create things is really a very big part of human activity as a whole. There is nothing else aside from that, in my view, in fact. But anyway, that's a separate debate. So to sum up, what Marx is really saying is that in producing the world, man produces himself, or rather humanity produces itself. Feuerbach abstracts man from productive activity. In the essence of Christianity, the essence of man is God. God is nothing other than the highest aspirations of mankind. But that argument has abstracted away from all productive activity, which is the majority of activity of human history. It's what moves human history forward, according to Marx. So Feuerbach doesn't even examine that. He doesn't look at the material circumstances of humanity at all. He doesn't look at the dirty Judaical manifestation of getting your hands dirty and working and building things. And he is not concerned with that, Feuerbach, at all. Hegel, on the other hand, is concerned with that, does recognize that it's that very activity, the activity of labor, that creates humanity, that allows humanity to evolve. Human evolution is dependent upon our creative, productive labor activity. But Hegel examines production but imagines it to be the work of an unconscious world spirit. He doesn't recognize that this is the world of materially existing. Well, he does recognize that it is the work of materially existing beings, but at another level he recognizes that there is an ideal world spirit that is guiding these materially existing beings, rather than the materially existing beings all there is in the world. So hence, for Marx, both fail to examine man in the concretely materialist way, because Feuerbach fails to talk about the productive activity and labor activity of man altogether, and Hegel talks about it but ascribes it to a world spirit. Hence both of them fail. So he's not trying to reconcile both of them. He's in fact saying both are wrong, without examining the productive activity of humanity that creates the sensuous world outside of ourselves, of which we are part. We are part of the material world. Our body can do nothing but obey the laws of the material world. If I throw myself out the window, regardless of what I think about the laws of gravity, I am going to fall down 2 flights of stairs, right? Or rather, I'm going to fall down 2 stories. That nothing can change that. So what Marx here is suggesting is that we, number one, are part of the material world. Our bodies are shaped by the laws that govern the material world, and Marx very strongly adhered to the idea that the material world is governed by its natural laws derived from its natural properties. We cannot escape that, on the one hand. On the other hand, and here's the interesting thing, we are creating and recreating and reshaping and reforming the material world through our activity, through our productive activity, through our labor. And how does that happen? Is there something outside of the human being which makes us do all of that stuff? No, it's man himself or herself, humanity itself, that is undertaking that productive activity. And humanity is made up of the very material, the same material on which we are acting. So this brings us to a very weird conclusion, which is that thought is nothing other than matter thinking about matter. Now this is so strange, because for thousands of years we have always believed, whether we are convinced by Plato or whether we look at religious philosophy, that there is something non-material within us which is what does the thinking. That the thinking is done by something transcendental, metaphysical, by a soul or by a great spirit or a world of forms that exists above the physical world, and somehow we interact or remember it, etc. The concept that matter can be self-conscious, can think about itself, is a radical idea. Very, very radical. And yet, all of psychology today and all of medical science today essentially confirm this fact, that the brain is what thinks. The mind is the brain in action. And the brain, of course, is made up of matter. When the brain ceases to think, the thoughts of that particular brain cease altogether. There is no place for those thoughts to go aside from the brain that thought them. So, now to sum up, the great mistake of Western Marxism and many other Marxists who misinterpret the thesis on Feuerbach is that they think that the question being addressed by Karl Marx is the question of how the mind, which is your subjective element, grasps the objective element, whether it grasps this actively or passively. They think that idealism accepted that the mind is active, that the mind orders the world, the outside world that we see, whereas Engels and the materialists thought that the mind is passive and that it only receives signals. Marx is, in my view, one of the greatest genius of this of our current historical epoch. If that is all he was saying in the thesis on Feuerbach, I would say that he has not moved even a step beyond Aristotle, who said the same thing 2,500 years ago. That is the question of whether the brain grasps things only passively, whether the brain receives things only passively like wax impressions, or whether the brain orders the information that it gets, is a question that was resolved 2,500 years ago, when Aristotle very clearly elaborated and correctly elaborated that the mind not only passively receives information, but actively organizes the information it receives. So the question of the mind being cognitively passive or active is not the question that Karl Marx is addressing at all. Were he addressing that question, I would say that he is 2,500 years too late. The question has already been solved, answered, etc. The question that Marx is addressing himself to is an epistemological one. That is, what are ideas? Are they transcendental? Are they metaphysical? Or are ideas the result of matter reflecting on itself? That is the question he was answering, and he answered by suggesting in the 19th century this was a pretty radical idea. In the 20th century, I don't think it's such a radical idea anymore. In the 21st century, not at all. Most scientists accept this, that our thoughts are our thoughts. There's nothing external to our mind, brain and body which is thinking those thoughts or putting those thoughts within us. That's not a very radical idea in this day and age. And that our thoughts, obviously, whatever our thoughts may be, therefore, are formed by interacting with the world. So now briefly I want to return to Adorno and Horkheimer and all the Western Marxists who think that they've discovered something fundamentally new by suggesting that what Marx's theory of praxis is really talking about is that the subject and the object are one, and that the subject and the object are joined. What they are suggesting is actually 2,500 years old. They are just dressing it up in my view, they're just dressing it up in this fancy new vocabulary and making us think that they've discovered something radical new, or that Marx has discovered something radically new. The fact that the mind is both active and passive, the fact that we change the world as the world changes us, and that this is a dialectical, let's say, relationship, this is not rocket science. This is not something spectacular. This solves no problem at all. This solves no problem which has not already been solved. This is not something that has not been said for 2,500 years. After all, Aristotle said it, as I told you already. So therefore, I think what the Western Marxists and what the New Left has done is they've reversed Marxism into Aristotelianism, or sometimes into sort of Kantian agnosticism, rather than understood what it is that Marx himself is talking about. Marx is a thoroughgoing materialist, and that comes very prominently in his work on thesis on the Feuerbach, if you read it in detail and read it in its proper context. And that shows you that it's not Engels who should be the whipping boy of the materialist interpretation of history, or of the idea or the notion that obeys certain laws. And that those laws can be discovered and understood. And once those laws are discovered and understood, that humanity can consciously regulate its own society and history. That idea belongs to both Marx and Engels. That idea that the reason why humanity is unable to overcome its own annihilation is that Humanity has been unable to understand what is the power that governs history. Humanity has conceived that there's a power aside from humanity that governs human history. But in fact, what Marx wants humanity to realize is that human history is nothing other than the activity of human beings themselves and themselves alone. And that activity obeys certain laws because human society is organized in a certain way, in the particular way in which it is organized, i.e. Classes and so on and so forth, and the way in which the forces of production and the means of production interact, or rather, play upon each other. These laws of history, if we were to understand them, if we were to understand what are the necessary laws of history, we would become free. Freedom is a recognition of necessity, Marx says, sort of deriving these ideas from Spinoza, and by which he means that when we realize and understand that we ourselves alone govern history, if we understand what are the laws of history, we will not be the results of our actions will become those that we intend rather than be those that we never intended. And that means that we will have conscious control of our own destiny, and that will end the alienation of mankind as a whole, and that will bring that will happen in this new phase of human evolution, or intellectual evolution, that Marx and Engels referred to as communism. Hope you enjoyed that lecture on the 200th birth anniversary of Engels. Please leave your comments and don't forget to subscribe and share this video. Thank you so much.